Yeah, working. Very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Inge Hutter. I'm the rector of the ISS, the place that you're here. Very warm welcome to all of you in the audience, and a very warm welcome to all you all speakers. Very warm welcome. To tell you a bit about ISS, International Institute of Social Studies, we are an institute, we exist for 66 years, established in 1952. First, actually really established for capacity building for students, mid-career students who come to do the MA in development studies. And since that time we have been developing into a more research-intensive university institute. Since 2009 we're part of Erasmus University Rotterdam. So also a warm welcome on behalf of the university. They know that you're here and they enjoy it that you're here. And what we want to play, both the university and ISS, university is doing teaching, we're doing research, but we also believe that it's a duty of the university of 2018, 19, 20 and the future, also in the past, to play a role in society and to be a university embedded in society. So in that way, this discussion of this afternoon fits very nicely with our goal, and I think it's a very interesting and a very, very relevant topic to focus on. I think I leave it to here because I can tell a lot of other things, but very welcome to an institute that values social justice and equity, and I think that's what it's all about this afternoon. Jeff, do you take over?
Thank you very much, Inge, and again, a warm welcome to everybody here, both students from the ISS. I saw the list, at least the people who are arriving, which for data protection reasons will be deleted, so you should all know that. You should also know that this event is going to be recorded. The presentations that you're going to hear from our guests is going to be later available. The discussion is not going to be available because of the data protection laws, so I'm also obliged to inform you of that. So again, my name is Jeff Handmaker. I teach here at the Institute of Social Studies, and I do research on legal mobilization. And I've had the pleasure to get to know the people around this table over some years. Around two issues that I've been involved with in my career, the first being apartheid in South Africa, the other being apartheid in Israel and Palestine. So this is a critical discussion, and there will be, of course, debate with you as well, because as Inge underlined, we are very much interested, and we find critical debate, respectful critical debate, very important. So, the history of South Africa, the history of, more specifically, of apartheid in South Africa, is quite well known to most of you, I would think. It was a very long period that did not begin in 1948, but it certainly took on a very different character in 1948, with two particular events that certainly, in John Dugard's book, Confronting Apartheid, which of course inspired the name for this event. Thank you very much, Professor Dugard. He mentions two particular events in the book, namely the Sharpeville massacre in 1960 and the demonstration and the violent police response to demonstrations by students in 1973. Both of these events, of course, immortalized in photographs that you see also up there. It was racialized discrimination, it was institutional discrimination, and it really led to then an international crime of apartheid, which we're going to be discussing today. So, the issue of perspective, of course, is always very important to mention here. The perspective of a white person, as Professor Dugard acknowledges very clearly at the beginning of his book, was, certainly always will be, very different from that of a black person in South Africa. This was the experience of black people in South Africa who daily had to, on their way to work, to pass signs like this: caution, beware of natives. School children grow up in this society, and being the father of two young children, it resonates even more strongly than it did before I became a father of 2 children. So when I see pictures like this, I also think of my own children. They were on the front line of protest against the apartheid regime in South Africa, and in many cases really did pay the consequences for that. So, from South Africa to Israel, Palestine. Well, Palestinians mainly, like mainly black South Africans, have been fighting a struggle for self-determination. It's a claim, a legal claim, which derives from a core principle of international law, which again, Professor Dugard has played a very significant role as a scholar, as a member of the International Law Commission, and in various other roles, also as United Nations Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories in helping to explain, to frame, and to relate to the actual circumstances here and earlier in South Africa. Of course, as it happens, both Israeli Jews and Palestinians have based their own claim on self-determination. But each of these claims is accompanied by, as they always are, with a political narrative. And these narratives are fundamentally different, as you will hear during the presentations today. What's really key here to mention is that politics really do matter when you're looking at how international law is framed, certainly how it's mobilized, instrumentalized by governments intending to suppress criticism, and especially in relation to broader claims of social justice. So this is an image which is very common in presentations like this. It's also an image that Ronnie will no doubt make reference to in his presentation. There's been, as a result of the conditions in Israel and Palestine, a lot of fragmentation of the land, fragmentation of the political systems, and fragmentation of the Palestinian people. Many say that the possibility of a so-called two-state solution, which is the official position of most states to resolve the matter, has become an illusion. Against a backdrop of self-determination, which was granted to Israeli Jews but denied to Palestinians, Palestinian land confiscation and large-scale human rights abuses, Israeli lawmakers, 62 in favor, 55 opposed, with 2 abstaining, passed a nation-state law in July of last year, 2018. Among other provisions, this law provided that the state of Israel is the national home of the Jewish people, in which it fulfills its natural, cultural, religious, and historical right to self-determination, and that the state's sole language now is Hebrew. Formerly, it was Hebrew and Arabic. Immediately after the passing of the nation-state law, there were protests throughout Israel and throughout the various territories that Israel occupies with the military and with various settlements. Protests of tens of thousands, again, Israelis as well as Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, and the Golan. The word apartheid has become a very regular feature in these protests in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territories. One certainly clear reason to organize an event like this. So is it apartheid? Well, Adalah, which is an Israeli human rights organization, claims that it is. It's lodged a lawsuit within the Israeli courts. And not simply in the West Bank and Gaza, but throughout the entire territory under Israeli control. That's the basis of Adalah's claim. Golan, as we saw very recently, just like Jerusalem, as Dugard has noted in his book, have been annexed recently by Israel. So is it apartheid? Well, other international lawyers, in addition to Professor Dugard, feel that it is. These include Richard Falk, Princeton University professor and co-author of a 2017 United Nations commissioned report on Israeli practices towards the Palestinian people and the question of apartheid. On the 23rd of March 2019, the current Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, Professor Michael Link, in an interview with the Belgian newspaper, mentioned that there is no word that describes the situation in Palestine more accurately than apartheid. So apartheid is more, obviously, than an international law definition. I'm in an Institute of Social Studies, so if I just kept to the law, I would be failing in my work as an international lawyer working on development issues. So, although apartheid defines relations, is defined within international law, it also defines relations between different people, between different ethnic groups. Living in the same territory. This is Hebron. To the left are Jewish settler colonists, most of whom arrived recently. To the right are Palestinian inhabitants who have lived in the city for generations. The image evokes not just a legal reaction, but also other dimensions of the debate on apartheid. And here, and I'm nearly finished with my introduction, there are 6 dimensions of the debate. And here I'm making reference to a very recent book edited by Philomena Essed and other colleagues. She spoke in this position not too long ago. And one of these authors in this book is Jeffrey Barnes. He identifies, in addition to the international law definitions, other dimensions that we need to take into consideration when looking at apartheid. Well, one is also what constitutes race. The other is the role of settler colonialism as a historical force. Furthermore, the spatial segregation by race and ethnicity. Finally, furthermore, the relationship between labor and the national project. And finally, the various responses that take place at the local level. And you will be hearing reflections on each of these by the speakers at the table here. Professor Dugard, in his book, which incidentally is available over there, thanks very much to Stanza Books, states on page 207, and I quote, "There are 2 ways of approaching the question of apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territory, certainly. The first is empirical, which entails a judgment based on personal observations of the occupation and life in the OPT. The second is legal, which requires an examination of the occupation in the context of international law." So again, I thank very much my colleagues sitting around this table for joining us this evening, and I'm now going to introduce them. First of all, to my far left, he will be speaking first, Professor John Dugard, longtime professor and now retired of international law, including at the University of Leiden. His book, Confronting Apartheid, documents a lifetime of scholarly work and professional engagements, particularly with the United Nations, in relation to 3 apartheid regimes: Namibia, then Southwest Africa, which was occupied by South Africa, and Palestine. Professor Dugard will address in particular how international law has played a role in condemning the apartheid regime in South Africa and Namibia, and how it is also relevant in relation to Israel's violations of international law, including, as many international lawyers argue, the crime of apartheid. Mr. Shawan Jabarin, to my immediate left, is a distinguished lawyer, human rights advocate, and member of the Executive Committee of the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva, based in Geneva. He is also General Director of the ICJ-affiliated organization Al-Haq, which in 2009 won the very prestigious and important Gozepenning Award, which most people here in the Netherlands will know. That was in 2009. Jabarin will share the experiences of Palestinian lawyers who have challenged what they regard as Israel's apartheid policies in the West Bank by way of the courts in countries around the world through international organizations and in other means. Again, also, thank you very much for joining us. To my immediate right, we have Ms. Adri Nieuwhof, a writer, a journalist, a blogger, and human rights advocate. She worked from the late 1970s with the Holland Committee for Southern Africa, then the largest anti-apartheid organization in the Netherlands and possibly in Europe, with more than 45,000 paid-up members. Nieuwhof will share her past experiences mobilizing globally against apartheid in South Africa and more recent experiences mobilizing against Israeli apartheid. Thank you again for joining us. To my far right, and will be the last speaker before we engage in the discussion with you, is Mr. Ronnie Barkan. Mr. Barkan is an Israeli human rights activist and founder of the movement Boycott from Within. he currently faces what his lawyers feel are preposterous charges of assault and trespass for remarks made during a speech of an Israeli cabinet minister last year at a university in Berlin. He felt it was very important to mention this because it shows how lawfare is being used against people who are exercising their right, according to the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, to protest. As a critical Israeli, Barkan will discuss his responses to what he and some other Israelis regard as Israel's policies of apartheid by way of nonviolent resistance, both in Israel and abroad. Thank you again to all of you. And I would now like to hand over, before I hand over, my last slide, I promise you. Every discussion, respectful discussion, has to have rules. And in a sensitive topic like this one, it becomes even more important. And these are the very simple rules which should guide any respectful discussion. And they're inspired by previous speakers, including a colleague known to many of you, Omar Barghouti, who's spoken here on various occasions. The first is that there will be no ad hominem attacks against individuals. There will be no form of bigotry tolerated. We all respect each other's views. And we ask you, please, to ask questions rather than to make speeches during the discussion part. And then finally, as I mentioned already, the event is being filmed for later reflection and, at least in terms of the presentations that you're going to hear right now, publication. Thank you very much for listening to my introduction. And I would like to hand over, please, to Professor Dugard. If you just press this button, then the microphone will start.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. Jeff did indicate to me that he would like me to address two questions, which I will read out, and then I will address them and make a few related comments. First of all, Jeff asked, what is the value of international law when it was so disrespected in apartheid South Africa and now Israel, and secondly, how are the functions of international law and its institutions to be improved to enable them to address apartheid? Essentially, these two questions relate to the subject of what to do about apartheid in the occupied territories and Israel itself. I don't think there's any point in discussing the question of whether apartheid applies in the occupied territories. I think it is today accepted. I was very surprised that even The Economist, which is not known for its radical views, acknowledged the other day that apartheid was applied in the occupied territories. So I think we have to move to another stage, and that is to address the question of, is apartheid as applied in Palestine worse than it was in South Africa? And secondly, what is being done about it? Should one compare the response of the international community towards apartheid in South Africa with that in respect of apartheid in Israel? But first of all, let me address the question which Jeff asked. Why was it that South Africa was so disrespectful of international law and Israel is likewise disrespectful of international law? Well, I think one must bear in mind that South Africa was not as disrespectful of international law as Israel is. South Africa was very concerned about international law. It was careful not to become a party to any human rights treaty so that it might be held accountable for violating a human rights treaty. The result was that the international community was compelled to argue that South Africa was violating rules of customary international law, state practice, which prohibited race discrimination and apartheid. And South Africa always argued that these rules of international law were not generally accepted, and South Africa had not accepted them. So the South African government was very careful to argue that it was not in violation of international law. it was also very respectful of international institutions. At that stage, there was no International Criminal Court, but when it came to the International Court of Justice, South Africa did, in 1962, decide to accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice in respect of a complaint brought against it over Southwest Africa and Namibia, and to the surprise of everyone, South Africa was actually successful before the International Court of Justice in 1966. South Africa, the South African apartheid regime was aware of the fact that international law was important, that it counted, and it was careful to do its best to avoid being accused of being in violation of international law. Contrast that with the Israeli position. First of all, Israel is a party to almost every human rights convention, and so it can be held accountable for violating these international treaties. Secondly, Israel is careful not to appear before any international institution. It makes it very clear that it's not accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice or any other international court. There is a claim now brought against Israel before the Committee on Racial Discrimination, and that's really because there was a loophole that the Israeli government forgot to close. Whereas the South African government was very determined not to appear to be in violation of international law, quite frankly, Israel does not care a damn. And Israel is, of course, quite correct, because Israel knows that it may violate rules of international law with impunity, that it is protected by the United States, and that it is also protected, let us be frank, by the European Union, which never really criticizes Israel for violating international law. So we have this strange situation today that whereas the South African government was not above international law in respect of apartheid in South Africa, Israel is certainly above international law in respect of apartheid in Israel. We've seen that in the attitude of the United States, in the movement of its embassy to Jerusalem, its recognition of the annexation of the Golan Heights. But we see it too in Israel's arrogant attitude towards international law. Israel simply ignores international rules on the construction of settlements, for instance. The International Court of Justice has held that settlements are unlawful. The Security Council has held that settlements are unlawful. I have no doubt that when, as it seems it will happen, the Israeli government under Mr. Netanyahu annexes settlements in the West Bank, certainly the United States will welcome this and do nothing about it, but I'm prepared to wager that the European Union will issue a little statement saying that this is not a nice idea, and that will be the end of it. So don't expect any response from Europe. Europe is complicit in the attitude of accepting Israel above the law. Jeff's second question is what is to be done about international institutions? Can they be improved? And my answer to that question is that there's nothing wrong with international institutions. It's the persons who are responsible for working in these institutions who need to change their attitude, and also it's the states who support these institutions that need to change their attitude. When it comes to the United Nations, there's nothing wrong with the United Nations except the US veto in the Security Council, which blocks all action against Israel. The International Court of Justice is fine, and we do now have a case involving Palestine before the International Court of Justice. Palestine is suing the United States for moving its embassy to Jerusalem. But when it comes to the ICC, one finds that this institution, which I like to put mildly is dysfunctional and a disappointment, refuses to take action on the Palestine brief. It's very clear that Israel is in violation of international law, at least in respect of settlements. The law is clear and the facts are clear. You have 700 to 800,000 settlers in the occupied territory, which is contrary to the Rome Statute. Why does the prosecutor not take any action? Why has she not taken action for 9 years? Because one really must go back to 2009 when the matter first came before the ICC. The answer is very clear. It's because Israel doesn't want it, the United States doesn't want it, and the European Union doesn't want it. And there are representations made regularly to the prosecutor not to act in these cases. So it's not the institution that is at fault, it's the will, political will to ensure that these institutions do their job properly. I see my time is running out, but let me just return to what I said at the outset. I think today one should be concerned about what we do, what strategy we adopt on the assumption that Israel does apply apartheid, and also on the assumption that international institutions are not doing their job properly in this respect. I think we have to concentrate more on mobilizing public opinion and persuading governments to be more active. And I think we can accept that they do now recognize that apartheid is applied by Israel, but I don't think that this seems to make any impact on governments and public opinion. So one must go to the next stage, and that is to compare apartheid in South Africa with apartheid in Israel. And I have no doubt in my own mind that apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territory is worse than it was in South Africa. It's more brutal, it's more humiliating, it's more racist. And I think one needs to get that message across to the public. And I think one also needs to remind the public of the action that was taken during the years of apartheid in South Africa by the international community in order to persuade South Africa to change. And I think one needs to spell out in detail what the international community did in order to bring about change in South Africa. Let me end on a note which I suppose is familiar to. How can we really justify the holding of Eurovision in Tel Aviv at this time? First of all, as far as my knowledge of geography is concerned, Israel is not a part of Europe, but that seems to be overlooked. But if one looks at the history of apartheid in South Africa, cultural events of this kind were not held in South Africa during the apartheid years. The South African government created this Bantustan Bophuthatswana with its Sun City and its mega city for cultural activities and concerts. And these were boycotted by foreign artists. You remember Bruce Springsteen's song, I Don't Sing at Sun City. Why is it that international opinion is not engaged in the same way today as it was during the apartheid years? And I think we need to focus on getting the message across to the general public that it is incomprehensible that we accept that apartheid is alive and well in the occupied Palestinian territory and possibly Israel itself, but we do not apply the same standard that we applied in respect of South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks for Professor Dugard for his presentation. I would like to make my presentation short as much as I can. When we take, just before that, I would like just to make slight correction on the introduction. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a human rights activist. Okay, I have international law degree, but not a lawyer, you know. Anyway, when we go with the delegations, they come, international delegations, when they come to visit Palestine and show them what's going on in Hebron and other places also. Every time they came with the reaction, said that this is worse than what it was in South Africa. This is. Even the South African, those they used to live under the apartheid regime, this is the same conclusion and reaction. I think it's not just a matter of law and legal, issue that apply to two different ethnic groups living in the same piece of land. It's beyond than that, I think. And it's not just a domination by the Israelis over Palestinians. No, they want to maintain that. But it's beyond even that. Beyond that, because they don't want Palestinians to continue existing on their land. That's the transfer, the eviction. They don't want to see Palestinians on their lands. That's, I think, the main policy also behind all of their practices. Discrimination is one, domination is one, killing is one, restrictions is one, but they build like a system, physically, administratively, economically, politically, to lead to one main long-term plan, is pushing Palestinians outside of their land. That's what it makes it different when it comes to comparing it with South Africa. And when it comes also to the system, legal system, it doesn't work because, the High Court, it's like an occupation wing. It's a judicial wing of the occupation. It doesn't work. They try just to put their rubber stamp on the resolutions, decisions, rulings on cases. And when it comes, for instance, to land confiscation, they said this is a political issue. The settlements is a political issue. We can't intervene on this issue. I don't know how it comes, just a political negotiation between Palestinians and the Israelis. This is part of the thing. The question here is, with all of these facts, there is no actions. And more than that, they are gaining and they are making profits and making business in the occupied territory, which it makes it more complex. It's not just an issue of a presence, ideology, things like that. No, it's also a big business. Just you can imagine, around $8 billion a year, the Israelis pillaging from our natural resources. I'm here not accounting also a gas in Mediterranean Sea, and I'm not accounting also calculating the gas and oil in western side of Ramallah on the Green Line. This is also another thing. This, this occupation, I think it has completely different nature. And I still remember, when we studied this, the first question came from Professor Dugard when he was in his last report before the UN Human Rights Council at that time, when he was the special rapporteur on the occupied territory. He said maybe it's a time to examine the question of the occupation, if this is an ordinary occupation or beyond that. And when we studied that, we discovered, legally, academically speaking, that this is not an ordinary occupation. This is an occupation with the nature of apartheid and colonialism, which is even beyond ordinary occupation. That's, I think, an issue. And it's not an academic issue. It's a daily, facts on the ground. People live in this situation. And to speak to you openly these days, okay, we say that Palestinians, they were success to stay on their land. But with this young generation, they are looking for jobs. The percentage of unemployment is increased dramatically. Now they are looking for their future outside. And when I speak to the Europeans, for instance, because they are the closest one to the Middle East, I say, hey guys, the next also round of immigrants is coming from Palestine. You have a direct, really direct interest to stop that and to intervene. Another issue is international law. It's not just principles and good words and values here and there. If there is no political will, there is a relation with politics. If there is no political will to implement that and to apply that, no way for the international law to function and to come to work, which it means that there is an absence of political will to respect, the obligation under the international law. That's the case. What to do? I think, always I say that there are two international communities. One is formal and official, and one is public. In my point of view, beside also pushing states to take actions, I think to mobilize a public, to take actions and to put pressures on the officials and the governments. Without that, no way to respect and to implement international law. No way to change the situation. No way to hold the criminals accountable. I think the threat by the US to the ICC, this is also beyond what anyone thinks that it comes from states. Now, these threats, it will not go without, impact, even to our case. And I think what's going on now, the delay and more delay, maybe part of that is not just a pressure, but also the aggressive way that the US, John Bolton, and Pompeo, they made just lately. And when they stopped, giving a visa to the international prosecutor, this is an issue. It means that we will not hold, and you can't hold the criminals accountable. And if you don't, and if you can't holding the criminals accountable, it means that the crime will continue. That's ABC. I will conclude by saying a few words. I think there is a consensus refusing against what's called apartheid. Because of that, when we say apartheid, it's not just to bring the attention of the people, because the facts also in the ground, it's apartheid and beyond. That's the case. And here Israel, when they refuse that, they know what it means, apartheid, in people's minds. And here maybe it will bring more people to fight against apartheid. And in our point of view, this is apartheid and beyond apartheid. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's create some energy, because Jeff asked me to reflect on the years that I, at Holland Committee on Southern Africa, supported the liberation movements in their fight for freedom, justice, and equality. And I thought, let me focus on one campaign to give you some ideas of ways to mobilize people. At the Holland Committee, we responded to the call of the African National Congress. They had called since the 50s for sanctions. And it was taken up in the 70s by focusing on Shell. BDS, the call for sanctions, BDS, we felt you give people a tool to become active. It's a tool to mobilize people. Because when we see images at that time from apartheid in South Africa, or nowadays, for example, the Great March for Return, you feel really ill when you look how people are killed by the Israeli snipers. So BDS is a way to offer an action perspective. So what we maybe can learn from Shell, we will see later, but what we did is, in the 70s, we joined Kairos, a support group of the Christian Institute in the Netherlands. They had started a Shell campaign, and the motto was "Kick Shell out of South Africa, Shell stop fueling apartheid." And to show you it, the campaign lasted until apartheid was abolished. Shell never left South Africa, and it was not always very at the same level of intensity, but it was a determination. Shell, you have to pay, and it was a tool to educate the public. The story of Shell, you could talk about apartheid and what it meant for people and what the role was of this company and what the role was of our government. Shell was important because oil, South Africa didn't have oil, so they were depending on oil imports, and Shell played a role in the imports and was present in South Africa. And by organizing over the years various activities, let me give some examples. What we did, we developed and strengthened a network of groups in the Netherlands. We provided information to the groups, but also to a wider audience. So that's where creativity comes in. Letters to newspapers, invite guests, events like this. At universities, the Studium Generale, really try to find platforms wherever you can find and reach out to people. There were meetings with Shell directors. Well, we know the outcome. We sought allies, the churches, trade unions, political parties. I must admit times were different then, because looking at the political parties now, I don't see many parties as an ally. Even the Green Left, in my view, failed in giving us support in BDS activism. We participated in Shell annual shareholders meeting. We invited high-profile speakers on to the meeting by buying a share for this speaker. Buyers Naudet at a certain point spoke to the meeting, and that, you know, you generate media attention. We called for divestment. Later in the campaign, there was a consumer boycott, and we produced information about oil companies that were not present in South Africa or were not involved in delivering oil. And some local groups succeeded in convincing their city council to adopt a resolution not to buy from Shell, which of course was overruled by the national government and said, no, that's not you don't have the power to do this. In particular, I would like to mention the role of the Shipping Research Bureau that was founded by Kairos and Holland Committee on Southern Africa. And every year we produced a report which revealed which companies were involved in the oil trade to South Africa. And the ANC and the United Nations worked with the information, pressurizing governments, and activists pressurized the companies. The reports, the release of such a report drew a lot of media attention, and in the end, it was released in several countries at the same time. And it was really very fulfilling to learn later, in 1992, the paper South African Business Day reported that the actions had resulted that the oil imports increased with $2 billion per year. So we never knew that this could be an effect. So while you are active, you think, oh, I am such a fool, what am I doing? You know, I don't see a result. And later you learn that it was a token of hope for the people, but also that some actions came at a cost. The lessons I learned during these years, I applied in the case of supporting the Palestinian people in their fight for justice, freedom, and equality. And now BDS is also a useful tool to mobilize people. We have seen that in quite a short period, in many countries, there are actions, that there are successes. And I can tell you the lesson I learned from then with the Shell campaign. I applied it to Palestine, and it's no coincidence that Veolia became one of the first targets of the BDS movements. Because what I learned is an international presence is important, because it means that many countries can join in the actions. And also it's a consumers know Veolia because they are involved in water supply, in transport, in waste management. So it's visible, people know. And Veolia was implicated in serious violations of rights of Palestinians with its involvement in the Jerusalem Light Rail project, which connects illegal settlements with Jerusalem. And it was operating a landfill in the West Bank, and waste from inside Israel was dumped in this landfill. And it ran bus services to settlements. And the first success in the campaign, I can proudly say, you remember, a small group of people in the Netherlands, Jeff was part of it, convinced ASN Bank to divest from Veolia, and everyone was surprised. Internationally, no one knew that it was a small bank. But the fact that a bank openly said, we divest because Veolia violates human rights with these activities. And in the end, what we didn't achieve with Shell, we achieved with Veolia, and they sold all their activities in Israel. So it is possible in campaigns where you really work together and keep on pushing. And when I look at what are basic topics to address while campaigning, when you campaign, you have to base your campaign on solid research. Your information must be spot on. The demands that you have must be based on international law. It's not that I want Veolia to withdraw. No, we want because they are complicit. A company is complicit, or a country is not living up to its obligations. And then you come with the examples. coordination with the Palestinian BDS National Committee, because when it fits the agenda of the Palestinian BNC, you can really have a much more impact, because more countries will follow that agenda. It doesn't exclude other activism, but if you want to make an effort, it helps to follow an international agenda, be creative, seek cooperation with allies, and be prepared to continue till apartheid has ended. Because, you know, if we give up, what is our message to the Palestinians? So here am I, since 78, involved in advocating for rights for people. And it says a lot about my character. But I really can't stand injustice. And I think my advice to people is, we know that there's a lot of bullying and there are attacks on people who advocate for BDS, that we should stick to our agenda and not be distracted by the bullying, and don't enter into discussions that the other party tries to set the agenda. No, we are here to defend the right of Palestinians, and if you have a problem with it, that's fine. We continue. And we all should know that defending international law is an honorable thing to do. And that's it.
Thank you. Where are we? Okay. Good evening. Usually when I have to introduce myself, I would say the way that I like to think of myself, which is that I'm a conscientious objector to military service and activist in the Palestinian popular struggle and an activist in the Palestinian-led BDS campaign, the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign against Israel. But there is a far easier and more precise way to introduce myself, and that is to say that I'm a privileged Israeli Jew. It's not the way I perceive myself, it is the way that I am defined, legally defined, by the State of Israel. What does that mean? That is my identity card, when I still had more hair. My citizenship is Israeli, but my nationality, according to that, is Jewish. My fellow citizens in Israel are also citizens of the state, but they have different nationalities, like Arab or Circassian or Druze. The Ministry of Interior of Israel recognizes over 130 different nationalities, other than one, Israeli nationality. There is no such thing as Israeli nationality, because if there were, then it would mean that at least on the face of it, there would be some basis for equal standing among Israeli citizens. So they have to make a distinction. And we will elaborate on that. This is kind of what I would like to focus on. On the other hand, this is my passport. My passport, like every other Israeli passport, is a fraudulent document. In Hebrew, it says that my citizenship is Israeli, which is correct. But in English, which is the important part, it says that my nationality is Israeli. Now, in most countries, citizenship and nationality are synonymous. People think that they are the same thing. Not so in Israel. They have built, both Israel and Palestine, both Israel and South Africa were founded as founded apartheid in 1948, while the case of apartheid in South Africa was quite literally a case of black and white with a few gray areas. The Israeli form of apartheid is a much more sophisticated form, and they had to create a whole system that is basically a dual-layered system where on the face of it there is something that seems like a democracy, seems like something that is more liberal, and at the same time there is another layer that is the more important one, which safeguards rights only for a select group at the expense of the others. And I'll demonstrate that. So this is why, from the very beginning, since the very foundation of the State of Israel, there is this distinction between citizenship and nationality. If you're interested, there's also another category called religion. So myself, for example, I have an Israeli citizenship, Jewish nationality, and my religion is regarded by the state as Jewish. But there are other people whose nationality would be Jewish, but their religion would be no religion. And all kinds of quirky things like that. Okay. This is a quote from the Israeli embassy. Every Jew being born in Israel is a citizen under the law of return. For that matter, an Israeli Arab born in Israel is a citizen by virtue of birth. The slide was more elaborate and I wanted to simplify it, so I only used that because we don't have time, so I will kind of whiz through a few slides just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about when I refer to apartheid within Israel proper, or what we call Palestine 48. This quote by the Israeli embassy is again very revealing. What it says in practice is that every newborn, every baby gains citizenship. A newborn, two Israeli citizens gain citizenship by one of two different methods. If they are newborns to Jewish Israeli parents, they will get citizenship under the law of return. I'll elaborate about that in a moment. If they get citizenship, if their parents are Israeli citizens but not of Jewish origin, then they will get citizenship by residency. And there are two legal paths that they walk from the very first day of their lives. Jeff mentioned this map, which is very educational about the annexation of land. It's very clear, okay? There was Palestine, now there's something that we call Israel. Israel and Palestine are the exact same spots of land, only that more and more land has been annexed into that entity that is called Israel. What you see here is the annexation of land, and we can elaborate on that. But I would like to focus on something else, which I think that is usually missing when we look at that, because the issue is not only about land. Land is part of it. The main issue is who are the people who are allowed to live on that land? What is the demographics of that territory? So I would like to focus on the second map, which is basically the partition plan, the UN partition plan of 1947, where the UN decided to partition the land of Palestine into two territories. One would be a Palestinian state, the other what they call the Jewish state. Has nothing to do with religion, it has everything to do with ethnicity. When we say Jewish state, okay? It's not about religion, it's about ethnicity. This is the UN partition plan, simplified. Now, on the right side, in the green area, there was supposed to be roughly 700,000 Palestinians. On the left side, the white area, there was supposed to be roughly 600,000 ethnic Jews, along with 500,000 Palestinians. This also counts around 100,000 in Jerusalem. I said I simplified it. In 1947, yes. You see, the Palestinians had no reason to accept that plan, obviously, so they rejected it. Why would they give up? Actually, they were supposed to give up more than half of the land for the sake of those people who were, most of them were newcomers to the land, colonialists. They constituted no more than 30% of the population back then, and they had far less than 10% of the land in their possession. So this UN partition plan was very unfair. But there's another thing to remember about that plan, that it was never implemented. It was rejected by the Palestinians, of course, but it was also not accepted or rejected in practice by the Zionists. It was accepted on paper, but not more than that, because this plan goes against everything that the Zionist project is about. The Zionist project in Palestine, in order to establish this so-called Jewish state, it is inherently not only about colonialism and taking over, usurping the land and the resources and so on. It is primarily about exclusivity, about having a land for one and only one type of people, at the expense of all the others. And having two colors on that map, having blue and green, sharing the same territory, goes against everything the Zionist project is about. So that plan was never, ever materialized. What happened in practice is something very different, which is that. On the left side, this is a quote from the UNESCO report on Israeli apartheid by Professor Tilly and Falk, which we mentioned before. And they list the 4 domains of Palestinians that are living to this day under the direct effect of Israeli apartheid. Israeli apartheid is defined in the Rome Statute, the crime of apartheid as defined in international law. On the right side, you have an infographics by Visualizing Palestine pretty much saying the same thing. You have the different domains there. So I would argue, without going into too many details here, I would argue that there is certainly no two states at this point. There is a one-state situation. It's not a one-state solution. It is a one-state condition, a very unfair one state. Or the way I would put it, it is a multiverse of states. You have many states which are layered on top of the other, depending on which ethnicity you have, what is your heritage, where you come from, who your parents are, and so on. So on the same spot of land, you have different people have different rights in the entire land, not only in the West Bank and Gaza. It is very important to mention about the UN report that it squarely blames Israel of practicing the crime of apartheid, which is a very serious crime, one of a few crimes that is defined as a crime against humanity, on par with genocide. Another thing is that apartheid applies to all 4 domains of Palestinians, including those who are outside of that territory. The roughly 6 million Palestinian refugees who have been living in forced exile for the past 7 decades for the crime of wrong ethnicity, simply because they are not among the privileged group. And just a brief point about the history. Israel, the Zionist state, was founded in 1948 by basically ethnically cleansing the land of its indigenous population, and immediately afterwards making sure that those who have been expelled by force will be denied the right to come back home, and those who remained on their land, because not everyone was expelled, will be denied equal standing. So this is why I say that Israel was founded as an apartheid state, because the whole legal framework that was built in place immediately after the expulsion was done in order to do that, to deny the people to come back home and deny equality for those who remained. So all of those, including those in the diaspora, are to this day living under the influence or the effect of the crime of apartheid that is practiced on a daily, hourly basis by Israel. This is according to the UN report. Just a few examples. I think I have to whiz through. Okay, very quick examples. Jeff mentioned the issue of race. This is a quote from Golda Meir, Prime Minister of Israel, in a very interesting and heated debate in the Knesset, in the Israeli apartheid parliament. And she refers to the issue of mixed marriages. And she says, one heavy calamity, meaning the Holocaust, already hit us. It is intolerable that precisely now, when a Jewish state exists, the number of mixed marriages increases. And then she carries on, and I will not read the whole thing. She says, I consider it the most important thing with a capital T. What is the most important thing with a capital T? To deny, to make sure that there are no mixed marriages, or that there are as little as possible mixed marriages within the state. Jews marrying Jews, Christians marrying Christians, Muslims marrying Muslims, and so on. It is regarded by her as a question of security, state security. Therefore, by the way, Israel has also entwined religion. They have nationalized religion, which has, again, nothing to do with Judaism. Judaism has absolutely nothing to do with nationalism. They have nationalized religion for their sinister purposes, and therefore you have courts that are for marriage and divorce. It is impossible to have a civil marriage in Israel, only a religious one for that purpose. Voting and participation is another quick example that I will give you. The other day there was an Israeli elections to the Israeli parliament, which I refer to as the apartheid parliament. And this is why, mainly. There's many reasons, but this is why. The top part is from Israel's, from Basic Law, the Knesset. Article 7A says that basically any party cannot run for elections if it denies Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. There is an amendment to that law saying that not only the party platform, but also any individual running for elections, if they express themselves, even verbally, on Facebook or something, against Israel as a Jewish and democratic state will not be electable. And about this specific law, that same UN report says that this is akin to allowing slaves to vote, but not in order to abolish slavery. Yes, Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, or 48ers, those who are citizens of Palestine 48, they do have the right to vote. Most of them, not counting East Jerusalemites. They do have the right to vote, but what is the value of that vote? Are they able to transform Israel into a democracy? No, by law, they cannot do that. Possibly last example? Yes. Last example, I'll just leave it there. We can talk about it later. National resources. I said there are national rights. National rights include the resources, for example, land, water, others. They are reserved for the select few, the select group that I belong to. And it comes at the expense of the others. And finally, and most importantly, this is the discourse that I would like to promote. This is, you don't have to go into all the details, but you have two categories here. One is of the privileged group, the other is of the underprivileged group. In total, there are, no one knows the exact figures, somewhere between 18 to 20 million people who are under the rule, under the influence of Israel, of the Israeli, the Zionist regime. Only 1/3 of them actually have rights. The rest do not. Most of them do not even have voting rights. So when we talk about suffrage, there's 56% who do not have the right to vote, and an additional 8% of those roughly 20 million who do have the right to vote, but their vote means very little. How can we still regard Israel as a democracy? So this was my vote from a couple of days ago. This is a picture that I took at the polling booth the other day.
Well, I must confess that I'm rather conservative on this issue. I tend to focus very much on apartheid as a crime in the occupied territories of Gaza, West Bank, and East Jerusalem. I do that for a number of reasons. One reason is a strategic reason. I believe that the occupation should be the focus of attention, and that one should focus on apartheid in the occupied territory for that reason. Secondly, I think it is difficult to find that the crime of apartheid, as defined in the Rome Statute, is committed in Israel itself. Briefly, that definition requires two different racial groups, Palestinians and Jews, that we have in both Israel and in the occupied territory. Secondly, there should be certain humane acts carried out against one racial group by the other, and it's quite clear that more inhumane groups are carried out against Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. There's more torture, demolition of houses, construction of settlements, forcible evictions, torture, killings than in the occupied territory than there is in Israel itself. And thirdly, one has to establish that there's an institutionalized system in terms of which one group dominates the other. I think it's much easier to prove that apartheid exists in the occupied Palestinian territory than in Israel itself. And for that reason, I say possibly. Now, I know that Professor Falk and Professor Tilley have taken the view that apartheid applies to Palestinians not only in the occupied Palestinian territory, but also in Israel and also in the diaspora. And I think this is a bit far-fetched. I mean, in the diaspora particularly, it's very clear that it doesn't fall within the definition of the Rome Statute. And I have my I'm very friendly with both Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley, but I've made it clear to them that I disagree with them. And I'm very prepared to debate this issue, but that's why I use the word possibly. I really think for strategic reasons in particular, it's important to focus on the crime of apartheid in occupied Palestine. But of course, many disagree with me. Well, I think it's very interesting to compare the approach of European states to apartheid in South Africa with the approach that they adopt to apartheid in Israel. First of all, there's an association agreement between the European Union and Israel, which confers certain rights upon Israel. But I think what is particularly interesting is that the European Union does maintain links with Israel generally and in respect of the occupied territory as well. There's no attempt to really take action against Israel. I mentioned the Eurovision, which is a good example, but the European Union often, and member states often issue statements condemning Israel's actions, but they never follow that up with real action. Take, for instance, the policy of recognition of the state of Palestine. Very few European states recognize the state of Palestine. Iceland and Finland, Iceland and Sweden do, but most European states do not recognize the state of Palestine, and they allow relations to continue virtually as normal. And of course, we know that they say that you should not sell or that produce goods produced in the occupied territory should not be marketed in European territories. Of course, we know that's nonsense. You can go into Albert Heijn any day and get Israeli dates that are clearly grown in settlements in the Jordan Valley. And I've taken this up with Albert Heijn, and Albert Heijn say we haven't got a clear instruction from the European Union to do otherwise. Let me just tell you how to deal with this matter. When you go to Albert Heijn, take some Israeli dates. Go to the counter, and when you let the shop assistant ring up all your purchases, and then you say to the shop assistant, I'm very sorry, I see that I bought stolen goods, and would you please deduct them? So then they have to deduct the stolen goods. Meanwhile, the queue is growing at the end. And people are saying, what's going on here? What's all this about? And then you turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, I bought stolen goods and I'm returning them. I think that's the sort of way that one needs to deal with Albert Heijn. You need to make your own public protest. I must confess that my branch of Albert Heijn is getting a bit bored with this. But there are so many ways in which a Harvard products. You can go into virtually any supermarket and you'll find a Harvard products on sale. These are the Dead Sea cosmetics. The European Union is not serious when it comes to implementing its policies. Compare that with South Africa. Do you know that that as a white South African, I was not welcome in any Dutch university during the apartheid years? There was a total ostracism of white South Africans. It was really very, very severe. But this doesn't extend to Israel today, there's no serious attempt on the part of the European Union to take the kind of action against apartheid there that it did in respect of South Africa. And as a South African, let me tell you, I'm very angry about this.
Just a small comment regarding the first question. I understand, Professor Dugard's position because we are in the same line for practical, pragmatic, also reasons. The criminalization before the International Criminal Court, because even if you address the Palestinians in side, the Green Line, Israel, there is a big question about the ICC and its jurisdiction over the people inside Israel. That's for practical reasons. But when it comes, for instance, to reality and the facts, I think we have to deal with the Palestinian as one people, one identity. And here we see the discrimination and we see the domination, I think, and we see also the practices regarding the house demolitions, taking in my account, the Araqib village in Negev desert. It was demolished more than 130 times. This is an issue. When you take, for instance, the unrecognized villages, when you take the uprooted villages and towns and cities, and you see the people, they are living away 500 meters away from their property and from their land and from their houses, but they have no right to go back to their property. What do you mean? What do you call this? And in the same time, you bring others, you bring those there immigrants from rest of Europe and the rest of the world, and just you build the houses for them on the remains of the Palestinian villages. This is in 48, and it's still is the same. Just, a few days ago, I went to Haifa, and we went to one of these villages called Ma'lul, and we met with the people there, residents, they are there. And one of the cases, she's a woman, now she's 71 years old. And when her dad, killed in 48, she wasn't born. She born directly after that, maybe a few months after that. And now the grave of her father, it's like in the village. She can see it from distance, but they don't allow her to visit the grave of her father. And she goes there just every day to that area. And she had her case before the Israeli High Court 20 years ago. And they haven't decided about that case. And I think they have to decide on 24th of this month. She has a case. And Adala represents her. And the only thing that she wants is to go to visit the grave of her father. That's an issue, And here it's easy. It's easy, I think, to approve that there is an apartheid inside also the border of Israel. This is clear, But for practical reasons, I completely agree and I understand that. Regarding EU, completely I understand and agree with Professor Dugard on this.
With the EU, it goes beyond, as Professor Dugard said, statements, and then they leave it there. But it's worse. The EU is actively encouraging trade with Israel. The research programs of the EU allows participation of Elbit Systems, a weapon manufacturer. Ahava benefited from the EU research programs. The EU funds schools, funds health services in occupied territory, while I thought that the occupying power had the duty to look after the population it occupies. So in a way, the EU funds, in my view, the occupation. I'm an activist, I'm not a lawyer. So I think what the EU does is it facilitates Israel's continuous colonization of occupied territory. A lot of money is thrown in, and when it comes to the imports of settlement produce, it ends with the guidelines, and then it says it's up to the national governments to monitor and to police. And then you have to go to the custom systems, and there's no mechanism to control. And I'm sure that many of the products from occupied territory may end up in packages which say made in Israel. So I think the EU is complicit in Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people. And looking at our government, I don't see change, and I'm in favor of, we have to mobilize, we have to be creative, and find ways to continue to make the case that there is a group of people in the Netherlands, and the group is much bigger, much larger than we may think, that are ready to support actions. Before we went here, I looked up an opinion poll from 2006, and it was shortly after the ICJ opinion on the wall. At that time, 2/3 of the Dutch people interviewed said that the Dutch government had to increase the pressure on Israel to comply with the ruling. So it shows there is a basis, but the challenge is, how can we mobilize these people? What actions can we think of that, we can show there is a part among our population who says it's enough.
So, about apartheid within 48, I think it is a crucial issue, but I hope that we will have time to discuss it a little later. About the EU, I would like to agree with everything that has been said, but only add something, that the EU is not partly, but wholly, totally complicit in Israeli crimes, and even if we just take the example of the EU-Israel Association Agreement that was mentioned, there is a binding clause there, Article 2 of the agreement, that says that the EU, I'm paraphrasing, the EU cannot carry on doing business as usual with Israel. By law, not only international law, also according to European law, the EU cannot carry on doing business with Israel. They can take corrective measures, sanction, freeze the agreement, whatever. What they cannot do is carry on doing business as usual with Israel. What that means is that every member state of the EU chooses to look the other way and violate not only international law, but also their own European laws in order to protect Israel.
Okay, I saw 2 hands up, 3 now. One first was over here, please. The first question was actually, how is it that a child is treated based on their nationality? Ronnie, would you like to maybe answer that first?
Yeah, and there was the question was also about criminality, like if let's say someone commits an offense, what happens, right? So as much as the law is built in a very, very discriminatory and racist manner, there are 3 laws that explicitly use the term Jewish in them. Again, not Jewish by religion, Jewish by ethnicity. So there are 3 laws that explicitly give privileges to people of one so-called nationality at the expense of the others. Nowadays, there are more than 50, more than 70 actually laws, and you can see them on the Adala website, which rely on, build upon these former laws, and there's a whole base of legislation that is discriminatory. At the same time, there are much more discriminatory practices. So when you visit, hopefully you don't, but if you have a chance to visit an Israeli prison, inside Israel proper, or Palestine 48, it is very evident. It is very evident that, you know, the mass, just like in the US prison industrial complex, the vast majority of the inmates would be people of color and so on. In Israel, it is Palestinians and Mizrahi Jews. And it is very clear how the system works and how there are the implementation of the law, not only that the law is discriminatory, the implementation of the law is very racist. As far as the law goes, a crime is a crime and should be treated in the same way on the face of it. This is a long answer. When we attended, we were in court accused in some Palestinian demonstration. When the judge showed up, she said, "Oh, they're Jewish?" Because she immediately kind of had to reassess the situation because she expected to see Palestinians who committed some offense, and all of a sudden she saw privileged Jews, so it was very weird for her. So I'm saying that the implementation would also be an issue.
Thank you. We had a question in the back there around issues relating to strategies, previous strategies in relation to the anti-apartheid movement, but also, issues in relation to the media.
Yeah, the use of visuals can be very powerful. And I don't have a direct answer to this. I think you really need to sit down and analyze, if we want to mobilize, is there a product that is entering the Netherlands that people buy? We had quite some noise about wine that HEMA sells. But wine is not a product that is bought by everybody, so I don't think that's a good example. But it was great publicity for BDS, by the way. So we have to analyze which products are used widely, and can you make a connection to the exploitation? And then translate it into a visual. So I'm all in for finding that and translate it also into simple messages, because it was also a very simple message: don't buy, and then the image spoke for itself. But that was a hit. That is maybe once in a lifetime, and maybe we have to find the second one. But that's really a challenge. But I agree.
Professor Dugard, the question about inhumane acts, can you maybe elaborate that a bit?
I had two questions. One question on the left, you asked me about religion, didn't you?
That was to them too, but for sure, if you want to respond as well.
But you raised the question of anti-Semitism, didn't you? Yes, and that also ties in with the response to the media. I think we have to face the fact that the big difference between the response of the European Union to apartheid in Israel and the response to South Africa is the problem of, well, there are two problems. One is Holocaust guilt. European states are still consumed, correctly possibly, probably, certainly, with the fact that during the Second World War, most European states, including the Netherlands, did not do as much as they should have done to protect Jews. So they are consumed with Holocaust guilt. That's the first one. Secondly, there is the problem of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is defined so broadly today that it involves not only criticism of Jews as Jews, but criticism of the state of Israel for carrying out apartheid. But the labeling of a person as anti-Semitic has very serious consequences for that person's career and for that person's social life. And I think most people are aware of this fact, so that they are not prepared to take action of the kind that they did in respect of apartheid in South Africa for fear of being labeled as anti-Semitic. And it's a very, very serious issue, and that's why I think one has to resist all attempts to define anti-Semitism so widely that it includes criticism of the policies of the Israeli government. To turn to the other question that I was asked, I concede that there is widespread discrimination against Palestinians in Israel itself. But my question is, does it fall within the definition of apartheid for the purposes of the Rome Statute? And here I have the difficulty that the International Criminal Court has laid down a test of gravity, and they will only act, if they do act, in situations that they regard as particularly serious. So, for instance, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has held that the killing of 9 activists on board the Mavi Marmara did not meet the threshold of gravity. So that's the first difficulty. The second difficulty is that the Rome Statute lists inhumane acts, and that there is it includes torture, killings, forcible evictions, persecution, and it doesn't include all discriminatory acts. And so, again, there's a limitation. And finally, just let me raise this question of the franchise. In South Africa, the main indication of apartheid for many black people was that they did not have the vote. Whereas Palestinians in Israel, whether they exercise the vote or not is another question, but they do, in theory, have the right to vote. They have the franchise. And I think that is also a factor that's been borne in mind. Look, I'm involved with trying to get the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to take action in respect of Israel. And it's an uphill battle. And the Office of the Prosecutor takes a very restrictive approach to the definition of the crime of apartheid and to the crimes committed by Israel. And let me just, you rest assured that if she's not going to act on crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territory, she's certainly not going to act in respect of apartheid in the diaspora or even in Israel itself. So this is why, for purely practical and strategic reasons, I think one needs to concentrate on the occupied territory.
Just I would like to comment in 2 small things. One, back to the complicity of the EU. Here I don't want to take the EU as a collective body. I would like to speak about the third state parties, the European countries. And in my mind, 2 examples. Many of the Israeli settlers and the Israeli settlers leaders, they are from Europe, and they still enjoy, their citizenship. This is an issue. And they still also enjoy a social security and pension funds. Yeah. And there are also charities. They still enjoy, the taxes exemptions or free taxes. And in the same time, these charities, they are supporting, helping, the settlers in different ways, which it means that they encourage and they are part of the crime. This is in my point of view. And here, when we go, in details about the complicity, I think we will find many, many different elements. The second one is about, the anti-Semitism things. I think anti-Semitic is an issue. It's an issue in Europe and elsewhere. But when you mix that with the criticism of the state practices and policies, I think it will undermine the anti-Semitism things. And here I think Israel, they use that for political reasons to silence the human rights groups, to silence those that are defending human rights and justice. That's, I think, this is a political use, which it will undermine even the anti-Semitic things by time. Because if we criticize Iran for its practices and policies and say this is anti-human or anti-Islam or something like that. I think this is a big problem. We have to differentiate between anti-Semitic and real one, and also the advocating for justice and the criticizing the state's practices and policies. Israel, they exaggerate with that, and I think it will undermine the anti-Semitic things. And also look at the friends of Netanyahu in Europe and see who they are. Thank you.
I would like to offer the contrarian view that it is not only about the minor occupation of 1967, but also about the main occupation and colonialism and apartheid of 1948. There is a whole system that was put in place. And when I talk about apartheid, I mean that system of apartheid, which 1967, the occupation of 1967 is no more than a symptom of. It is the most natural outcome to that system, but it is no more than the symptom. Now, I think that, first of all, we have to remember that the crime of apartheid, part of that definition of the crime is that there needs to be a system of oppression of one racial ethnic group versus others. And there is a clear case of that in Israel. This is how it was founded. And this is, for that very purpose, they needed to expel as much people as they could. And since then, to this day, these people are denied the right to come back home. Some organizations, for example, portray the Gaza March of Return as a protest, a demonstration against the siege, the criminal, barbaric siege on Gaza. It is not. It is also about that. But what is the return part? It is the return, their demand to return home. Home within what is regarded today as Israel proper. Okay? This is what it is about. It is not only that horrible, unbearable practice that is carried on since 1967, especially in Gaza. There are no words to describe the brutality of the situation. But the even greater, possibly, form of, if we have to compare, okay, the possibly even greater form of injustice and ongoing inhumane practice is against those who are denied the right to come home, and those, obviously, those inside who are subjugated ever since. I will only add one more thing. What Israel has to its advantage is public opinion. They have actually managed to convince the world that there is something legitimate about that Zionist project in Palestine. They have managed to convince the world that there is some form of democracy, flawed democracy, something that has a whiff of democracy, when everything about that state is built on the exact opposite of democratic values, meaning the exact opposite of equality, rights of minorities, multiculturalism, and so on.
Thank you very much. Of course, we're talking about legal definitions and also the strategic value of legal definitions, but there are at least 5 other dimensions that we can discuss in relation to apartheid, and that, of course, is why we organize this event, focusing on legal definitions, but also beyond that. So thank you for those further clarifications from both sides. All right, Ronnie, please.
Okay, so I owe a response about the issue of anti-Semitism was mentioned, or also the false accusations of anti-Semitism. I think that the best response would be to say that there is absolutely no connection between Zionism and Judaism. Zionism uses and abuses Judaism for its sinister purposes. Judaism is a religion of hundreds or thousands of years, and Zionism is a mere old 100 and some years. It is a nationalistic, racist, supremacist ideology. Actually, Zionism is also inherently anti-Semitic, but we can talk about that. I wrote articles about that. I can send you links. I totally negate any conflation of Zionism and Judaism. More than that, most Israeli representatives, they say that if you are critical of that criminal apartheid state, you must also be somehow anti-Semitic. And we have to be very strict here with the logic. What they're saying, you know, if A leads to B, then if not B leads to not A. What the logic of their statement says is, if you are Jewish, then you must be, because of your Jewishness, whatever that means, in a broad sense, you must also be supportive of that criminal apartheid state. This is what they're saying. I cannot think of something that is more anti-Semitic than that, to say that somehow, because of my Jewishness, I'm inherently supportive of that criminal enterprise. So this is about the false claim of anti-Semitism. The issue of academic boycott was mentioned, so I will just mention very briefly the PACB, the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. There are clear guidelines that make the distinction about what is boycottable and what is not boycottable. In a nutshell, we boycott the institutions, the criminal institutions. We do not boycott the individuals. So we do not boycott academics in Israel. We boycott the academic institutions because, unfortunately, every single Israeli academic institution and every Israeli university in Israel is complicit, heavily complicit in crimes. 2 of them, by the way, have a military base on campus. I'll end here for now.